Hi guys, Ricky Pope here, and today on the Christian Nerds Unite podcast, I am joined by Casey and Marie Norris from the Potato Candy Podcast Network to talk about tabletop role-playing games, plus scripture and nerdy news, and we'll get to all of that right after this. This week, we interview Casey and Marie Norris from Potato Candy. One of their podcasts focuses on horror-focused RPGs. That started me thinking about some of the dark, almost horror-like events in the Bible. God turning the Nile and all the water in Egypt to blood must have seemed like a horror scene to the people living in the country. Exodus 7:16-21 says, "Then say to him, 'The Lord, the God of the Hebrews, has sent me to say to you, let my people go, so that they may worship me in the wilderness. But until now you have not listened. This is what the Lord says. By this you will know that I am the Lord. With the staff that is in my hand, I will strike the water of the Nile, and it will be changed into blood. The fish of the Nile will die, and the river will stink. The Egyptians will not be able to drink its water.' The Lord said to Moses, 'Tell Aaron, take your staff and stretch out your hand over the waters of Egypt, over the streams and canals, over the ponds and all the reservoirs, and they will turn to blood. Blood will be everywhere in Egypt, even in vessels of wood and stone.' Moses did just as the Lord had commanded. He raised his staff in the presence of Pharaoh and his officials and struck the water of the Nile, and all the water was changed into blood. The fish in the Nile died, and the river smelled so bad that the Egyptians could not drink its water. Blood was everywhere in Egypt." If that's not a horror scene, I'm not sure what is. Today, I interview Casey and Marie Norris from the Potato Candy Podcast Network. I know it's a funny name. Casey and Marie are married, believers, and each are hosting a different podcast. Casey hosts Dreadful Tales, a kind of young horror RPG real play, while Marie hosts Blank Scenario, where she helps GMs with ideas and prompts for creating worlds and stories for their own games. Now, let's get right into the interview. Casey, Marie, it is so great to have you on the Christian Nerds Unite podcast this week.
Oh, thank you for having us.
It's great to be here.
So, Potato Candy is your podcasting network. Mm-hmm. Talk to us a little bit about who Potato Candy is and why people might look into what you guys do.
Well, I'm like, we're a cooking show. No, wait.
Yeah. That is one of the dangers with segment. The name.
Honestly, when I heard Potato Candy, my first thought was, is that a thing? I'm going to go look at it.
It surprisingly is, yes.
It is a thing. Well, I mean, I know there's potato pasta. Gnocchi is a potato pasta. Yep. And, there's potato bread. I'm thinking, potato candy. That's interesting.
Yeah. That was actually how we sold our friend on the name, was the fact his wife found out it's essentially a really awesome Reese's peanut butter cup. Because essentially it's like peanut butter with potato flour, and then it's rolled up, which is where we also got our symbol for our network from.
Fascinating.
No.
It's not easy to make, let me tell you.
It's not.
So how did the name come about?
Well, so we originally started this network with one of our good friends from college. Marie and I did. And with him and then his wife that's also on the podcast as well. And as we were looking up and trying to come up with a list of names, I think we had something like 20 names that were on there. And bless his heart, Isaac is dyslexic, and so whenever he writes things down, his writing.
You said that exactly the way I do.
Yeah.
Yep.
His writing is a little bit wonky at times. He'll tell you in the podcast, most of the time he doesn't write actual notes. He'll write in doodles. So putting the name down on there, one of the ones was supposed to be Radio Candy, which we still go back and forth on, like, should we change it to Radio Candy? But it looked like Potato Candy with the way that he wrote it down, and it stuck for Marie and I, and it took some convincing, and finding out that it was an actual thing was the deal that sold him on it.
Mm-hmm.
That's funny. Happy accidents. Happy accidents.
Yeah.
Oh, wonderful.
So now you guys have two different podcasts that you do.
Mm-hmm.
One is kind of a real play, and the other is more of an RPG help podcast, right?
Yep.
Give me a little more about those two different podcasts.
Casey, you want to go first? Yours is simpler.
Yeah. Okay, so mine is Dreadful Tales is the name of it. And it uses two different RPG systems to play. We alternate between characters and story arcs going back and forth. So one of the systems that we use is Monster of the Week with some editing to it, because Monster of the Week is certainly not clean friendly, which we set out from the beginning with Potato Candy that we wanted to create clean content. It didn't necessarily have to be Christian. And for me, I'll specifically say, back in college, we took story time. We took a course called Theater in the Christian. And in that course, one of the topics that came up was, does entertainment have to be specifically, quote unquote, Christian for it to be good content, or for it to be clean, whatever. And the answer that I came back to at the end of that course was, I mean, how can content be quote unquote Christian? It's just content at the end of the day, whatever that is. So the value that you place on it
can't be saved.
Yeah, exactly. Yes. Well, the value you place on it is going to be what makes it good or bad. And so approaching the show from that direction, I wanted to create a horror story, and there isn't much horror out there that isn't either completely boiled down to its squeaky clean roots, like childish horror, or you have stuff that is so extreme and out there that it's just, you walk away from it feeling like you've lost a couple of years off of your life, because it just it's not uplifting at all. Yeah. And so I wanted to strike that balance and create a story that was both creepy, but that didn't weigh a person down or didn't include things that we weren't comfortable with. So we try to walk that line very, very cleanly. But anyways, one of them is Monster of the Week, slightly edited to be able to be clean. The other one I do is one called Little Fears, which is a indie RPG.
Okay.
And I use Nightmare Edition specifically, but the basic premise of that system is that you are either anywhere from 6 to 13-year-old kid, and all of those monsters and scary things that you were afraid of as a child are actually real. They're not just figments of your imagination. So you get to go a lot of directions with that one. And I've had a lot of fun with doing that. The arc that we just finished up releasing, depending upon when this is released, the arc we just finished up releasing was the Little Fears arc. And we're going to be going back to Monster of the Week. And in that one, we've got Marie is playing a person who is somewhere in between, like, being possessed and maybe also dealing with her own, like, personal demons in the past. We got somebody who is the child of Hephaestus and running around with a fire whip. And then we've got Isaac, who is running around as a living statue from Russia that believes himself still basically to be in Soviet Union Russia. So it's an interesting ragtag group that you get running with that.
Interesting. And then the other podcast is more of a helping GMs with some guidance on how to set up scenarios. Is that right? Tell me a little bit more about that one.
Yeah. So Blank Scenario I had a whole list in my notebook of ideas for a podcast. And one of them I thought would be really cool was a 1-page RPG. and not necessarily an
Okay.
RPG, but a scenario at least of making a scenario that's legitimately one shot, because that's incredibly difficult to make for D&D.
Yeah.
But it fits on one page. It's simple. You come up within 30 minutes, give or take. We take longer than that typically, but it's close enough. And then recording it and basically creating it. Eventually, it simplified to blank scenario. And whenever I come up with the names, I just replace the blank with whatever the title is. So every single name ends in scenario. And
Nice.
it's evolved a little bit. Basically, it's nice because the show requires very little prep work on my end. I just say, hey, who saw something interesting, such as a meme or a billboard? And we spur the moment, spend 30 minutes making a scenario for it. It's been really fun because at the end of the episode, we take 5 minutes off screen. Everyone writes down their ideas and we present what we would do with what we've discussed so far. So you end up with about 3 to 4 different scenarios depending upon who's on the show. So it's really
Very
just
cool.
helping people realize you can take any story and just create it on the fly if you need to. It doesn't have to be really elaborate. It doesn't have to be super fancy. We had a guest on who writes scenarios for a living, and he came up with like a 4 to 5
Oh my goodness.
segmented campaign, and he's like, is this okay? I'm like, it's fine.
He put us to shame.
I know, I'm just super impressed you managed this. I was like, I feel like mine is not adequate anymore.
Yeah, most of our scenarios are like fast food. You know, you can take them and they're great, but it's like, okay, I'm good. I'm on to the next. And he was like, so here's the philosophy of this one. And
oh my goodness,
this represents this. It's going to be a 4-story arc. Okay.
Yeah, we're not quite there yet, but that's the main segment. We also have a couple of other ones. We have Link Campaign, where Casey and I are currently working on a long-form campaign, building it from scratch. It's a very fun Mad Max apocalypse-style world, so I'm really happy with working on that. Blank Mechanic, where we focus on the nitty-gritty of D&D, of the dice rolling for the GM behind the screen. And of course, I'm basically just like, what other name after blank can I use for a segment on the show now?
Very nice. Well, speaking of RPGs, hopefully by the time this releases, I will be releasing some bonus content for the Marvel Multiverse role-playing game playtest.
Oh, nice.
I have a group of podcasters that are getting together to playtest the new RPG. So we're going to be highly RPGing along the way. So and I know you mentioned a couple of different RPGs that you're currently using on the shows. What are kind of your favorite RPGs? We talked about this a lot last summer. We talked about this a lot last summer. I would always ask, is there something in particular you really prefer to play? And another question I like to ask, and we'll get to this one here, is there some particular mechanic you found in an RPG that you're like, I really love this specific mechanic that they have? But is there a particular one that you really enjoy playing?
I've never gotten to play a full game of it, but I love the Call of Cthulhu RPG. I had the book on my desk until I put it away this morning. It was on my desk ready to go for a game that I'm currently involved in for a play-by-post. But I'm mildly obsessed with Call of Cthulhu. Casey, don't correct me. I am mildly obsessed.
That's an understatement.
I got the rule book 4 years ago now. And I've never gotten to play in a home game of it because no one will run it for me. So I've had to run it for myself a couple of times.
To be fair, the book for that is like 2.5 inches thick. That is a long book to read.
It's technically, but there's a split version of it you can buy now. It's fine. But that's one of my favorites. Second favorite's probably City of Mist, just because it's kind of nitty noir investigation, but you play as someone who's inhabited by these stories from myths such as King Arthur, Beowulf, Lord Riding Hood. It's a really fun system, and it's a lot to figure out for a character, but it's a really fun system. It's powered by Apocalypse as well, so it's a very simple dice rolling system.
So
how about you, Casey?
So for me, the Little Fears was actually what came out of me trying to find. So I have several people around me that I looked around and I was like, okay, Marie is the Call of Cthulhu runner. Isaac, one of the guys that I know runs D&D, like that's his thing. And I was determined that I was going to find my thing. And it's really hard to find horror specific stuff that's not Call of Cthulhu. Because, say what you will about
Cthulhu horror or just weird.
It depends upon which version of the system you get. There are several spin-offs for other systems that are Call of Cthulhu marked.
Yeah.
Okay. I've always, when Call of Cthulhu comes through my mind, some people say horror, but I always just think weird. Mm-hmm. It's the weird world. It's not necessarily horror world.
Yeah. It was weird science fiction back in the 1920s, so it does fit within that.
Yeah. Teaching kids how to run horror games has taught me that horror is really just a tone, which is what makes it really hard to find systems that fit in with that. But Little Fears, one of the things that I love with that system is that it has some of the nitty-gritty to it of these are the specific dice rolls that you need to do. Combat is as tedious as it can be to run, is mostly simplified. So you're not having to worry about, okay, every single person take a roll. It's the way they describe it in the book is pick the strongest character. The strongest character is going to make the roll. People who want to involve themselves, tell me what it is that you're doing, and that's just going to add bonus points onto that main character's role. And I love that because it keeps it all smooth. It actually allows for turn order, because that's one of the problems that I've run into with any Powered by the Apocalypse stuff is that, yes, it's very cinematic and it's very flowy, but because of that, I'm a people pleaser. And that's hard to be a people pleaser in a game where you're supposed to like destroy the hopes and dreams of your players in combat. Because then I feel bad for anything that I do to them. So I have to have some kind of rules that I can hide behind and be like, well, this is what the book says. This has got to be the thing. So that's one of the things I've appreciated. But as far as a specific mechanic is concerned, I've greatly adopted the 50-50 approach. And it was another podcaster that I heard first use it, but it literally comes down to, if there's a moment in game where your players come up with something that's a good idea that you really like and you're not sure if it'll break your game, just say highs or lows or odds or evens, and then roll a dice and give them what they want or don't give them what they want. Bottom line, I've had some of the best story adjustments happen just on a 50-50 roll, because a player will come up with something that may completely not work and they don't get it with the 50-50. But if you've given them that chance, then they're going to start looking for other ways. And it just develops a lot more improvisation in game. It's just a lot more fun.
Very cool.
Yep.
What about you, Marie? Is there a particular mechanic that you've run across in a system that you're like, I really, really enjoy this mechanic?
The mechanic I always lean on that is from the Call of Cthulhu RPG system, of course. But it's one that I've actually pulled into D&D as well. It's called an idea roll. Within Call of Cthulhu, you have an idea stat that's based upon basically how intelligent you are. And so if your players get stuck in a mystery, because Call of Cthulhu is all about finding the clues and then running away from monsters because you really don't want to fight Cthulhu. But if they get stuck, they can roll the idea roll. And then you as the GM will give them information. If they pass, they get information that helps them in the case. If they fail, they still get the information, but something bad happens with that information as well. So rather than just discovering a drawer that has a notebook that you need to get the code for, secret access point, you open the drawer, see the book, and then see there's a tripwire next to it, and now there's a countdown timer going. And I pulled it into D&D as well with the intelligence stat. Just roll intelligence, set, 15 as a number, and just if you pass, you'll get some hints. If you fail, you get some hints, but it doesn't go well for you.
Nice. Well, when you're looking at a system, like some systems are really crunchy. Lots of dice rolls, lots of looking things up on tables, and a lot of times we call these RPGs, we call them collaborative storytelling. So some people run games that are, you almost never roll a dice. Roll the dice. You just, you're just going back and forth, and every once in a while you roll the dice. What's your your preference when it comes to role playing games like that? Do you prefer the really crunchy, give me all the rules so I can keep track of everything, or do you prefer the let's just tell a story and have fun?
This is a cheap question on my end.
I love both systems. I like the crunchy D&D. I really want to try to play first edition D&D as much as I know the numbers are crazy.
Actively playing first edition right now.
I need to try it at some point because I love the number crunching that comes with it. I don't want to run it at any point, but I love to play in it. But I also love with Little Fears how just I'm going to do this, roll a dice, and we move on. It's very simple. It's much more focused on the story. So from podcasting perspective, I prefer the more collaborative with less dice. From personal perspective, I love having a thick rule book that I spend hours going through and building a character and understanding all the rules and having all the numbers ready to back me up. I'm a details person, so I love that.
Me have dumb brain, me no detail. I enjoy the crunch if it helps me to guide the story, like specifically to guide the story. That is really super useful. But most of the time, I would rather the system not get in the way of a good story. So I'm kind of like Marie in that there's that middle balance in between. What was the name? I think it was Mithras was a system that I first found when I was like, oh, this is going to be the one. I love this. It's perfect. And I really started getting into playing it. And I think it was based on RuneScape. I don't know if that's going to connect to anybody else as to how detailed that is, but it was more detailed than I originally understood it to be. And so it, as amazing as it was, I just could not do anything with it. So whenever we've been playing, we've done entire sessions where we may roll a die at the time. But I think for me, that background in theater training and improv makes it a lot more fun to play off of what the characters want and make that dice roll mean something where like they're pressured or there's a problem going on and they're going to try to overcome it. Because that's where a lot of that tension comes from, is make that dice feel almost like the enemy itself, because that's that tension that you want there. And then for everything else,
ally.
Or ally. Well, goodness gracious. Okay, here's the thing that I actually do like. Now, speaking about the Little Fears system, because now she's making me think of this mechanic. One of the cool things that Little Fears does is it gives you basically a pool of dice that you can roll based upon the stats that you have. And it's like, okay, I've got this thing and I've got this quality, which will add maybe 3 more dice. And I've got this quality, will add something else. So you might be rolling like 6 to 8 dice at a time. Wow. But it only allows you to take the top 4 dice. 3 dice? It's been a while. Only allows you to take the top 3 dice. But if any of those dice, because it's only played with D6s, if any of those dice hit 6, they explode. And it keeps exploding until it's all said and done. So the original setup of Little Fears, it tells you that 9 should be an average roll. 12 should be a little bit more difficult. 15 above that. Marie, on average, will roll 15s. The highest she's ever rolled is something like 47.
No, we broke 50 once.
We broke 50 once. All with her, not sponsored, but all with her king and yellow sign dice that have basically been banned from the table. Because like I looked at the average in the book and I was like, okay, Blair, you've got to be wrong. There's no way that 9 is the average. Because, oh my goodness, they will roll so high every single time. And so I have
until
to
we don't, of course.
Yeah. And that's also fun. Whenever I'm like, okay, I'll set it at like a 15 or a 20, because they'll probably hit that 7.
Yeah. Yeah, every time.
So let me ask you this. This is something I'm dealing with right now. Okay. The Marvel, this is specifically the new Marvel system that I'm working with. I've played a lot of different games. I cut my teeth on old GURPS 3rd edition back in the 90s. And I played Champions in high school, but I didn't play a whole lot. GURPS was kind of where I really I had books and books on my shelf.
Mhm.
You know,
GURPS
Champions
will
was
do that
like,
to you.
yeah, oh, GURPS will do that to you. Champions was like, I borrowed the book from my friend long enough to build my character.
Yeah.
You know,
Mhm.
so, but never really played D&D when I was in high school, just because I just didn't have any friends that were playing. They were
Mhm.
playing something else. And then I was into the Palladium system because I was a huge Robotech fan. So I, read all the Palladium Robotech books, and but a lot of different systems I've dealt with. One thing I'm running into a lot with the new Marvel system is it's constantly telling me the narrator should just choose. They call the GM, they call them the narrator.
Okay.
Should just choose a number and allow the players to roll and see whether they,
Mhm.
whether they should hit that number or not. And I'm
Mhm.
struggling a little bit on where should I come up with these numbers so that
Mhm.
I'm not making things entirely too hard
Yeah.
or
Mhm.
making things entirely too easy. On a system I've never played.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Which has tons and tons of modifiers because it's really a pretty crunchy system. I'm surprised it's as crunchy as it is. So I'm struggling a little bit. So as a GM, how would you coach somebody on I know you don't know the system, but how would you coach somebody in general on making that decision? Like you said, I just decided 15.
Mhm.
Like how do you figure out what number you're gonna, if it's not something that's strictly in the book, if there's no
Mhm.
mechanic for this, I just have to come up with something and I'm gonna make them roll for it because I'm not sure if I want this to happen or not, and I'm
Mhm.
just gonna let the dice make the decision. How would you coach somebody through something like that?
Well, for me, I tend to look at I tend to think of it in terms of tiers. So there are 3 different tiers that I could put it at, and similar to what standard D&D and like every other RPG does, you consider your average, your difficult, and your level above that and beyond. And ultimately, for me, whenever I have to pick what difficulties I want things to be at, I try to look at where I want the story to go, what will service the story best. Because on one hand, that might be a really difficult role, but boy, when the player overcomes it, then you get that really epic moment for that player in that moment. And it almost at the same time would feel cheated if you put it too low. So for me, servicing the story always becomes the best first step of how difficult do I want this to feel to that player? Because that's the other thing. Like, it's the same thing I run into in the classroom. It's the disconnect between a teacher and a student. A teacher understands everything perfectly. They can see the whole picture. And from the student's mind, it's like you gave me this little bit. I don't see everything that you see in your head. So same thing from GM to player. As a GM, I can see the whole world. I can see that there's this creature that's right around the corner that they have no idea about. So how difficult do I want to make this feel for them? Because they're now having to pick up their dice and put fate to just a random roll. I don't know if there's a specific number crunch that I would say to go through, because again, like me, dumb brain. But if you want to get crunchy with it, put yourself in the position of what do we want to say, like a rounded number that you can think of like, okay, this is average, this would be a little bit more difficult, and something above that, and then just go from there. Because even with something like D&D or Little Fears, where it says here are these 5, 10, 15, 20 kind of averages, you're still going to have that on a sliding scale of somewhere in between based upon the world that you're in and the difficulty that those characters are dealing with.
Yeah, and I would second. I tend to think in terms of dice averages. So most dice, like D6s, roll an average of 4, I think, and then like a D10 rolls an average of 6, and whatever, so on. So if you know the average, you know that's the die they're rolling. I typically add on at least like 1 or 2 points just because if they have a modifier, it's easier. So therefore, the higher number should be possible to hit. If they don't have a modifier, it means they're trying something they're not skilled in. So I drop that. So therefore, it's going to be harder for them to hit that. I tend to think very realistic to the world as well. Whereas Casey is focused on the story, like what would make it interesting? I'm like, okay, realistically in this world, if you don't have the power of flight, you're not flying. So to make this jump without something that helps you, it's going to be a lot more difficult. So I tend to think in terms of what are the rules that I've set for this world? And then if you're going to roll a die, how difficult is it going to be based upon what you have that's going to affect that ability? So for Marvel, if someone has a flight ability and they want to, catch up with something that's in the air, they're going to have an easier roll than someone who doesn't, because it just doesn't make sense to that person who can't fly to have the same number as person that can.
So when you guys are setting up scenarios, and I know one of your shows that's what you do. When you're setting up a scenario and you want to create a world, where do you get your where do you kind of get the ideas that you want to put into this world? I know some GMs actually get thoughts from the players to help flesh out the world. Some GMs would never think to do that. But for your personal games, not necessarily like the show where it's like, give me a prompt and we're going to come up with a scenario. But when do you start sitting down? It's like, I'm going to set up a new world, a new plan, a new story. Where do you get your inspiration personally?
I usually start where the question always is for me, what's interesting? Because if I'm not invested in the story to start with, the player's never going to be. We were out at dinner Sunday night with some friends, and I made a mention it'd be great to do D&D with everyone playing the Ninja Turtles. And immediately 2 people at the table like, yes, let's do it. I'm like, I just thought it'd be fun new Ninja Turtles in a D&D system. Because to me, that's interesting, which means the players are also going to be interested in it. And so if the players don't want to do something, I tend not to push it, although I will sneak something in there that I like at least. But if I know I'm interested in it and I know the players are down for it, that's usually where I start from. Okay, this is a good framework. I'm going to build the details that I need, and then I'm going to let them know where they fit into the world for their characters.
Yeah, for me, if you listen to Blank Scenario, you will hear 9 times out of 10, whenever it comes to my take on the prompt, it is way more complicated than a one-shot and typically has the difficulty of being slightly convoluted. It's the nature of my brain that I tend to overcomplicate things rather than simplify. So the first step, similar to what Marie said, is finding an interest. And usually either it's like an environment that I want to be able to send the players to that could be fun, or if there's more recently, it's been a lot of accents, because I collect accents as a person. If there's a specific accent on a character or an actor that I like a lot, and so I'll start practicing it. I'm like, okay, where can I throw that character in? What would that be interesting to run with? And I'll go from there. But a lot of times, it just comes down to creating what I want my overarching theme to be, or overarching idea to be. I think it was last summer. No. Last spring, I took a writing course in horror because I wanted to be able to like grow what ability that I had, and so I still use a lot of steps from that. Of start with what's the thing you want them to be afraid of, then move from that into if we're writing a book, it's like, what are the characters that they're going to have? Well, I know the characters already. So what's the thing I want to delve into with those characters? What's the thing they're going to find out about themselves? Because I try to make sure each character gets a spotlight. That's the hardest part of any kind of developing story, because if you're not willing to give your characters that spotlight moment, then it just kind of loses some of its luster. Then digging into the monster, how's the monster or the problem going to develop itself, where the players are having to deal with it. And so I know you're not talking about specific to the show, but to be honest, like the show is about the only times we play anymore. That's the amount of free time that we have. So only being able to speak to that, the most recent one that'll be releasing takes place in Russia, and is there because Isaac's character in Monster of the Week is that Russian statue. And I wanted to be able to spend some time doing some Russian accents. And then from there, it developed out into, well, it would be really cool if there's this kind of town, and this town has some really interesting secrets to it. And it just developed out from there into this big old war of factions, and kind of a few dollars more meets maybe The Witch might be a good comparison to make to it. But that's where my brain ends up going, because it's like, let me connect it to this and to this over here. And so like I said, convoluted and complicated, and have to figure out ways to boil that down.
Nice. Well, I probably should have started with this question, but we're going to ask it now anyway.
Okay.
How did you both get started with role-playing games? I mentioned earlier that Heroes was the old Hero system was something that I played, and GURPS was kind of where I really cut my teeth on getting deeply involved. But where did you guys start playing role-playing games? How did that happen? What did that look like for you guys?
My dad attempted to get me into role-playing games in high school, and I thought it was too nerdy. Because my dad
and
grew
now
up playing.
You do a podcast about them.
I know. Now I'm like, well, I should take in his advice at that point. But I got into board games towards the end of college, and that led into RPGs. And I think I did one session of D&D where I played as a halfling, or not halfling. I played as a Goliath barbarian.
Yep.
And Casey was at the time playing a halfling rogue that I carried on my back and threw at people. Was it druid? Okay.
Yeah, it was a druid because I had a shillelagh.
Yeah, I was able to throw you. That's all I remember. And from that point on, I was hooked. And that was 2014 is when I started. And from there, it was just a downward spiral of what RPGs can I get.
Nice.
Yeah, for me, I don't have that same that same kind of story arc. I was homeschooled all 12 years. Me and all three of my all two of my older brothers, and being homeschooled, it was like, no friends, just family and together. And I remember one time when I was like 8, walking through a Best Buy and seeing a board game that looked really cool, and I wanted to get it. And my mom walked by and goes, "Oh, you don't want that. Those take too long to play." Well, it was some kind of strategy game that had the hex squares and the whole setup for it that, I'm a fancy nerd now. I know what these are. But I got my start doing Pathfinder back in college. Okay. And I think the very first time that I role played was actually online. It was over a summer campaign, and I bothered our DM to no end because I had just done the Big Friendly Giant, and I wanted to try to recreate the Big Friendly Giant as a character. And so we had like a half giant, half dwarf class that he created. And I was like, can I boulder roll and like roll people over? But man, that took forever to do. And then from Pathfinder, got into D&D, and that's where I stayed for a good long while until some of the shine wore off, and then moved into anything and everything I could find RPG, from Fiasco to Little Fears, Call of Cthulhu, Everyone is John, which I still love running.
Yep. We do an annual Dread game with our family where Dread is played with a Jenga tower. And so whenever you do something, instead of making a dice roll, you pull a block from the tower. So it's been great for family because everyone's gotten really into it. And the last game we ran, I did a Wild West campaign. And it got to the point where there's basically a shootout happening where everyone was trying to figure out who the marshal was and who was actually an outlaw, and everyone just shot each other. And of course, we're doing it as family. It's like, well, this is great. We have trust issues, apparently. But I think 3 people died by the end of it. It was very interesting.
Honestly, the Jenga tower is one of my favorite mechanics that I have ever heard of in a role-playing game. I think it's fascinating because it's there is some actual skill involved here and some luck.
Oh yes.
Yeah.
So it's not just the roll of the dice. How nervous are you?
Yeah.
Yeah. It's also great because we have technically 3 Jenga towers at this point. We have a standard, we have a miniature one that came with a die so you could roll to see what color you pull. And my personal favorite is the chalkboard tower that's painted black with chalkboard paint so you can mark on it. And the paint sticks more than a standard tower does. So it's got more friction when you're trying to pull a piece. It's fun.
Oh, that sounds horrific.
Yeah. I love using Dread up at school for my kids because I'll run for my smallest advanced class that I do. I'll run a Dread game for them every October, just as a kind of this is an introduction to storytelling and improv and all these different things. And as freaked out as they get more freaked out if somebody is goofing around the table that the Jenga tower's on.
So as a married couple who is playing, how does that dynamic work for you guys when you're playing a role-playing game? I had to ask this question.
Yeah. So I'll say my comment before Casey does, just because I don't know what he's about to say. There was a comment that our friend Isaac said when we were doing a game. It was just me, Casey, and Isaac. And Casey was playing a character that because I played a female character, he decided he had to flirt with every female character NPC that would show up. And Isaac made a comment, it's like watching 50 First Dates. And just seeing this happen over and over again.
Yep.
But for the most part, that's pretty minimal for us. We tend to be more focused on what the character is. So our relationship kind of just, it's on the sidelines. And we're just like, here's what my character does. Here's how they interact with the world. So we manage to balance that pretty well. I would say at least. Yeah.
I'd agree. Yeah. Whenever we first got married, one of the first, I wouldn't even say arguments, but one of the first real solid discussions that we had was sitting around a board gaming table. And, both of us are people pleasers. And she made the comment that she was sorry for something she did. And I just said back, I'm like, no, you're not. Because if you were sorry about it, you wouldn't have done it. So from that point on, we made the agreement that whenever it came to playing games, we weren't going to say, I'm sorry. We'll hug and say, I love you and make up at the end of it. But our goal is to be competitive. And a lot of times that carries over into the games that we run for each other of not necessarily I want to be antagonistic, but if you're going to be here, you want to have fun. And the way that you have fun is having those challenges come up.
Cool. Now, you mentioned something interesting there, being competitive. And earlier you mentioned something about, how the GM interacts with the players. So in a horror situation, in a horror story, I know there's kind of this, some people have this view as a player that the GM is always out to get us. And then there are certain GMs that are definitely always out to get the players.
Yeah.
And then there are other GMs that are constantly rooting for the players. But, the dice are what they are, and I'm going to go with what the dice say, but I'm rooting for you. In a horror campaign, is that any different?
I wouldn't say so. For me, at the risk of taking away some of the fun from Marie, I tend to lean more into that latter category of I want the characters to at least have a chance. And I think there's a couple times in probably both of the campaigns that are out right now where you can hear it in all of our voices the second that the dice hits the table and it's not the number that we wanted and not the number that we needed, that all of us are like, oh no, this character's about to die. And so I have to think in my head at that point, what's the price that they're going to pay? Because I've told them as well, the interest with the game disappears whenever death is taken off the table. Like, especially with horror, but that's when death is no longer there. What's the point, right? You can do anything and everything you want with no consequences. There always has to be a consequence of some kind. So then it becomes the point of how can I make this cost them something? And that to me is where a lot of the fun of it lies. Because I think death is always going to be on the table for our characters, and that's scary to say, especially for a system that deals specifically with kids. Like, that's a sensitive topic, but finding that balance between ensuring that danger is there, or that feeling of danger is there, and having to actually carry out whatever the case is going to be. It's a hard line to walk. It really is. It's the nature of the question.
Yeah. I think it helps too. I know as a player, I never feel like Casey's out to get us. As much as we roll dice and roll 50, we see his face just turn sour as he realizes we've completely ruined any chance of us having problems going forward. There's always the part that we know he's not putting us in these situations to kill us.
Mm-hmm.
He's putting us in a situation because this is where story's going. These are probably the choices we made, which is like 90% of what my character does most of the time. I tell people my character is the reason story progresses because I cause problems.
Mm-hmm.
So my character is usually in danger because I put her there. And now I have to deal with the consequences, and if the dice don't work for me, there's not much. I am about 99% sure my character in Monster of the Week is going to die horrifically at some point. I'm just kind of mentally like hoping I can have a sacrifice moment of, no, go, I'll save you. And then I can come back as someone else. We'll see if that happens, but
I don't know if Doc would be the type to be willing to sacrifice herself, though. That's the thing.
I've turned into Luke Skywalker, essentially. It's fine.
I mean, well, just because you've lost body parts like he does.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh,
I will say
goodness.
This is kind of in service to the question you asked earlier about developing stories, but it occurs to me, I forgot to mention, one of the things that I love to do, and this really just helps to tighter knit the players together if you do it right as a GM, is presenting your players with what you as the GM see as a no-win situation. Let me give you a situation where you can't win no matter what it is that you try, because I can't come up with anything, and then see what they come up with. And it has yet to fail me that they will find a way around it, something I didn't think of, something I didn't see, that will get them around that corner. Now, sometimes that still comes with consequences, but ultimately it creates a story that is much more cohesive in the long run, because they're the ones that move themselves into that position. But like what Marie said, when the player's the one making the decisions that gets them in trouble, then that's on the players. And I had nothing to do with that.
Yep.
So let's go. Let me ask you one more question about the horror aspect.
Okay.
Especially with this being a Christian Nerds Unite podcast. We definitely, at the Christian Nerds Unite podcast group, we definitely have a group of nerds that are really into horror. But there is a group of Christian nerds that have a lot of pushback against the horror genre in general. How do you address that? If you were receiving pushback from someone, how would you address that idea?
Oh, that's a heavy question. Being honest, I have not received any kind of pushback on it yet, but it would depend upon the thing that they have problems over. Because I think for me, like a lot of things in the world, we are essentially dealing in fantasy whenever it comes to the role playing specifically, but to horror, we're essentially dealing in a fantasy realm. So anything can be the case in that world. For me, I think the draw of doing something horror, and for me at least what makes it okay, is horror feels so much more real to life. Not that life is a horror story, but horror leans heavily into choices have consequences, and those consequences may be heavy and those consequences may be bad. But just like in real life, whenever characters make choices, whenever we make choices, there are consequences that come with them. And sometimes they're consequences we see coming, and sometimes they're not. One of the beauties of horror specifically is that there are so many subgenres to it that you can play around with, from psychological to, just pure monster mash to I mean, if you want to get grotesque with it, you can get grotesque with it. There's so many different categories underneath it. Just to give a broad ban on, well, it's horror, it's bad, I think undercuts the genre. Because, I mean, you know, there's Christian fantasy out there. And for some people, they would say the same thing, that undercuts, you know, biblical principle, or undercuts, you know. And at a certain point, it goes back to what I said before about quote unquote Christian media. If you can get past the idea that content specifically is Christian, because what we do with it is what makes it a Christian approach or not. If you can get past that, then ultimately it shouldn't matter. I'm not going to say it doesn't, but it ultimately shouldn't matter. But you know, if it's not your thing, I'm not going to force horror on anyone. There's enough trauma to go around for people without them playing around with something that already is hurting them.
Any thoughts, Marie?
Yeah. One thing for me that I was thinking about before the interview of we never intentionally made a podcast that was Christian, although we knew very, very early on that our views are going to influence the content we talk about, the shows that we put out. In a series that we no longer have, we had a show called The Curators, where Casey and I reviewed different movies, podcasts, books, whatever it was we had read, and just talked about them. And our opener was always, we are a 30-something-year-old married couple, Christian, with no kids, and that's our view. So people knew right up front, here's what we think and why. And I think for the shows, while we never say explicitly, we are a Christian show, here's content we don't do, there are definitely things that we don't cross the line on, but there are some things that we're okay with. For Monster of the Week, it's been hinted at that I essentially have a demon butler, that we have demons in this world. However, for what we set up, it's much less about a religious aspect and more of a interdimensional being. That we basically grounded it in sci-fi, even though we're calling them demons, it's a lot more of a sci-fi approach than a religious approach. And that's where we're comfortable with. Now, not everyone is comfortable with that, and I respect that. I know people that cannot watch any movies with a ghost or possession in it because that's too close to home for them. I have trouble with home invasion films for that reason. It's too close to home. I can't do them. I can watch a demon destroying stuff all day long and be fine, though. It's just what you're comfortable with and what you're going to be able to go, okay, this is fantasy. This isn't real. I'm not crossing any lines that I'm not okay with, so I can consume this and be fine.
Yeah, I think one thing that I would say, like if we want to take this in a biblical approach, it goes back to what's talked about in Corinthians about not searing your conscience at this point. If it's not something you're comfortable with, then you know you don't have to be around it. And no shame for those who don't want to be, because by all means, don't make things worse for yourself in the long run.
Absolutely. Good word. Appreciate your thoughts there. So let's kind of start wrapping up a little bit. Let me ask you this. Is there a system that you've always wanted to play, but you haven't had a chance to? Now, I know Marie kind of alluded to Cthulhu is kind of the thing that she's wanted to do, but she feels like she really hasn't yet.
I've managed it a couple of times with online games. It's not quite the same as sitting around the table with friends and getting to play through the system.
But is there a system that you've read about, or you thought about, or you learned about that you said, this is something I really, really want to try, I just haven't had a chance yet?
I've got two. Casey, I'll let you go first, though.
Okay. Well,
unless you're still thinking.
Considering what he said before, this is gonna bring down the shame. The closest I have ever gotten to playing GURPS is GURPS Ultralight, and I enjoyed GURPS Ultralight, but it is such a detailed, crunchy system that it scares me. And I would love to play it just because I got into GURPS because of the Film Reroll podcast. Listening to them do rerolls using GURPS is amazing. And I would love to be able to do that with GURPS, but like, man, the planning that would go into it, like I need more than a summer off to be able to do it. It just, one day. And I have so many books for it. I have so many books for GURPS. And
he uses them to plan every other system except GURPS.
Yep.
Hey, I will say the GURPS books are super well thought out.
Mhm.
There's tons and tons of research that go into the GURPS books.
Mhm.
They are definitely worth having as resource books on your shelf, even if you never play the GURPS system. I'm right there with you.
But the shame is real because it's right there. Oh, one
Nice.
day.
For me, there are two systems I would love to play in that I don't think I'll get the chance just because they're not systems I think I'd be comfortable with. I'd love to do Apocalypse World, the original system. There's a mechanic in that system, of course, that is based around the idea of your characters having sex, which immediately I'm like, how do I cut that out of the game?
Yeah.
But it's so interwoven. It's like, I can't cut it out of the game because they interwove it into the game. So doing a lot of the games that are based around Apocalypse World kind of fills that gap a little bit. There's a part of it that feels like there's still a way to adapt it to where it would be appropriate, but it's one of those I just don't think I could ever do without just rooting the system and just might as well do something else. The other one that kind of has the same issue is Vampire Masquerade. And it's mostly because the vampire aspect is just, it's interesting. How do you play a character that's not human, but is kind of human still? And that's an interesting balance. But a lot of people who play that system tends to lean more in the sexual aspect of the vampire is very suave and very sexy. And it's like, that's not something I want to dig into. So it's finding games for that don't cross those lines for me. But it's a fascinating system. I love the concept of fighting kind of inner demons and hunger and having to balance humanity with a monster. It's a great system, but most of the content they make for it isn't something I'd feel comfortable with.
Yeah.
And that's the balance for me there.
And what is kind of the next thing that you guys have on your plate? What's coming up that you're looking forward to?
I know for Blank Scenario, we're slowly starting to expand out our pool of people on the show. So I'm starting to have guests on. We've done a couple of interviews with people that have RPGs that either have been out or they're releasing. And so we got to talk a little bit about their content creation for their process. I'm trying to figure out other segments for Blank Scenario that I can do. And it's the balance between what's interesting and what's not been overdone. There's a lot of shows that do D&D topics and help and monsters. And so it's finding something that's interesting to me that will still have enough target appeal. So that's currently what I'm looking at for my show.
And when summer hits, hopefully, Dreadful Tales will be able to expand what it's doing. That's one of the frustrating limitations of being a teacher. It's like, well, I get 2 months. But for us, at the risk of sounding more nerdy, I don't know if anybody out there has heard of the Bailey School Children books. I was a huge fan of them whenever I was growing up. It probably is what kickstarted my love of horror. But they're a series of books that deal with kids that are in like an elementary school. And they think that all of the adults in their town are different monsters. And so like each book deals with a different monster or creature that shows up. Like Santa Claus shows up in one of them. But I think the very first one is vampires don't wear polka dots. And they get a new teacher that may or may not be a vampire. Anyways, I say all that to say this. Because I love Little Fears so much, I took that idea and I thought, well, if we're going to do guest spots or if we're going to have guests come on, let's create, based on those books, a session for each book and have a guest come through and, deal with the Bailey School kids or deal with whatever these things are and like non-copyright breaking somehow figure out a way to make these stories a little bit updated and cool to do with horror. So if I can start getting guests actually on and have the time to actually record with them, that's what's going to be coming down the pike eventually.
That sounds awesome. Well, where can people follow you?
On Facebook, Instagram. We need to get better at Twitter.
I've been trying to do better at Twitter. I'm not a Twitter fan. It's just not my style. There's way too much information. But Instagram, Facebook at Potato Candy Network, Twitter at Potato Candy Net because there's a character count apparently.
Yeah.
Yes.
We've also got our website, potatocandy.com, as well as email that you can reach us at.
I always forget about the website.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Obviously, you're not the one in charge of that
website. Yeah, I'm not. Dumb brain, no detail.
Well,
For
I
the
will
third-
definitely gather all those links. I will put them down in the show notes below. Marie, Casey, it has been wonderful getting to know you guys. I'm super excited about what you guys are doing. Definitely want to have you on the show again sometime to talk
Absolutely.
about RPGs and what other things you're doing over at Potato Candy.
Yep.
Thank you
Anything
so much for being
RPGs,
on the
Marvel,
show today.
We'll be back.
Yeah.
Awesome. It was great getting to know Marie and Casey. And check out the links down below in the show notes so that you can connect if you want to hear more from Marie and Casey. Well, that's all I have for you today. Before you go, I do want to leave you with this blessing from Hebrews 13. Now may the God of peace, who through the blood of the eternal covenant brought back from the dead our Lord Jesus, that great shepherd of the sheep, equip you with everything good for doing his will. And may he work in us what is pleasing to him through Jesus Christ, to whom be glory forever and ever. Amen. We'll see you next week. Blessings.
Hey.